This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Allen County SWCD Soil and Water Conservation District in Allen County, Indiana. So we're in Fort Wayne is the office. This morning we're presenting coffee and fall cover crops. My name is Mike Worthing. I'm a technical specialist agronomist with the SWCD and a conservation advocate using restorative ag on my farm. I have a 350-acre farm that I run all no-till cover crops, minimal nutrients additions, and try to keep it low herbicide use. We are recording this presentation for later use, so it'll be available on our website. You can get the link for it. Please have your audio on mute. We can also use chat. We will be monitoring the chat room, so that's a great place to make comments while we're going. I'm gonna have everyone right now. Would everyone unmute? We're gonna practice this. So all our viewers unmute, and I want to say good morning, everyone. Can you give me a good morning?
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
All right, thank you. You may mute again. So this morning we have Bree Ollier. Bree is the resource conservation at Hendricks County SWCD. Her previous job was in cover crop and seed sales, where she gained interest and a passion for conservation. On her time off, Bree enjoys working with her husband and daughter on their homestead. So I'm going to turn it over to Bree, and we get to learn about cover crops.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. And I'm going to share my screen real quick so we can get my presentation up here. All right. Everybody see my screen?
Yeah, looks good. Gardening with cover crops.
Perfect. All right. Well, good morning again. And I'm going to be talking about cover crops this morning. This presentation is mainly on gardening with cover crops, but if most of these same things apply to large scale ag, other than maybe the seeding and the termination of some of these. So if you have questions at the end on large scale farming with cover crops, I'd be glad to help with those also. I have been with the Soil and Water Conservation District down here in Hendricks County, in one of the donut counties, for about 6 years. And previous to working at the district, I worked for a grain elevator, and I sold cover crop seed for them for about 5 years. Before then, I just kind of remember my grandpa putting cereal rye out in his garden every once in a while. I had no idea what it was for or why. But once I kind of learned about it and gained an interest for it, I've had a huge passion for it, and I utilize cover crops in my own garden every year and have a lot of fun experimenting. So I guess just to get started, just with very basics, a cover crop is a crop grown for the protection and enrichment of the soil that is not harvested. In some cases, I mean, on some large scale ag, or even if you just have some livestock at your house, you can harvest cover crops as like a forage type feed source, but typically those are left in the field. So we can't talk about cover crops without covering some of our soil health principles. And I think my favorite thing about cover crops is they address all 4 of the soil health principles, whereas not all of our other practices do that. So they are a huge tool and can really make a difference when it comes to soil health. So we'll go through those. So the first one is minimizing disturbance. So like you heard Mike say, he's predominantly no-till or is no-till on his farm. So when you minimize the disturbance of your soil, you're leaving those earthworm channels, all that mycorrhizal fungi, any of those habitats that our microinvertebrates have developed in our soil, and keeping that aggregate stability there, which really helps water infiltration and a lot of those things. And when we use cover crops in our garden, they kind of are our tillage. Cover crops are known for their dense root systems and also for their like big tiller roots. So they will break up that compaction for us. So there's not really a need to till when you use cover crops. The picture on the left there is actually my garden just from 2 days ago. I planted potatoes, no dig potatoes. This is my first year doing those, and this is my second crop of those for the year. And it works fantastic. I always struggled with potatoes in a no-till situation, but I think I finally got it right. So if anybody has any questions about no dig potatoes, I'd be glad to talk about that later. Our other soil health practice is continuous living roots. So with a wide variety of cover crops, we can have continuous living roots all year long. So I know garden rotations are sometimes very intense, and we have a lot of different crops coming in and out, but there is a cover crop to fit most of those areas. So we've got some spring cover crops that can be planted. If you have like a later season vegetable going in, like tomatoes or peppers, or if you need something to survive through the winter, if you don't have perennial crops in your garden, there's cover crops to fit that too. So having those continuous living roots just enables us to provide food and habitat for that biology in the soil. Just because it's wintertime doesn't mean that they're not active. They need food all winter long, and they also still need that habitat in that place to live. And then maximizing biodiversity. So typically in our large scale agriculture is where we see more of those monocultures of maybe just corn and soybeans and wheat. In our gardens, typically there are a little bit more of a diverse rotation of crops, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes people just have tomatoes, peppers, and maybe sweet corn. So adding in this variety of species of cover crops really helps to get that soil biology going. And it also can add value not only to our soil, but as a pollinator value, since a lot of our cover crops do bloom. And then our last soil health principle is maximizing soil cover. So when our soil is bare, I mean, if you think about the only place in nature where our soil is typically bare is desert type areas. And that soil is very hot. It's typically crusted over. You don't find a lot of life there. So when we're adding that soil cover in our garden area or on our farm, that's really going to help you regulate the moisture and temperature. It's also going to lessen the effects of erosion. You have that buffer there when the rain comes, and also providing habitat for beneficial insects and your soil biology. So our cover crops offer all of these benefits when it comes to having cover for your soil. So when we talk about those soil health principles and cover crops are a huge part of the soil food web, because if you don't have those plants and those roots in our soil, we don't have anything to offer any of our microinvertebrates or bacteria or the animals that are around that area. If that soil is bare, once that residue is gone from our crop, they're really not left with much to eat for the duration of the season. So having those cover crops there and a food source available that you actually want them to eat instead of maybe our garden vegetables. I know we all have issues with bunnies and birds and predator insects and stuff like that eating our vegetables. So if you have those cover crops in there, giving them a food source, that can kind of help. So just a little demonstration. Not going to do the demonstration, obviously, since we're virtual, but just some pictures. So this is a rainfall simulator that I know a lot of Natural Resources Conservation Service offices or SWCDs use. So on the left, you've got your bin with your cover crop. On the right is a bare soil. And I realize I have it backwards now compared to the picture, both of them together. You can kind of see that simulates a 1-inch rainfall. So you can see in the picture after it was done, the barrel that is underneath the cover crop all of that water actually infiltrated into the cover crop. So when we get a droughty rain event, all of that water is going to be held within the soil instead of running off. I know I cut the one barrel off, so you can't see it very well, but you can see some of that muddy water down in the bottom of that bare soil. So without those cover crops, you are more susceptible to erosion. None of that water is infiltrated. So typically when we talk about tillage, we ask why people till. A lot of times they say it's to open up the soil and let air and water in. And that may be true for the first 1 or 2 rains, but typically with our soil types in Indiana, after those first 1 or 2 rains, we're going to get surface sealing. And that surface is actually going to crust up and not allow water to get in it. So with having those cover crops, we have all of those root channels, and the rain is going to hit those leaves. It's going to slow that raindrop down and allow it just to infiltrate into those root systems, and be held in our soil profile for later in the year when we have droughts, kind of like we have this year. I know some areas have experienced 2, 3, or even 4 weeks of drought, and then have received really heavy rains. So these cover crops are a fantastic option for when we have some variable weather patterns like we have this year. So I hear this a lot when I talk to either just backyard gardeners or farmers or even like production vegetable farms. Cover crops just don't fit. I don't think they're right. Cover crops are really right for everywhere. You can make them work. They can be a challenge. Sometimes it's increased management and it can be a learning curve. But once you get them there, they do some really amazing things. So whether you're a market gardener, a backyard gardener, even if you just do cut flowers, cover crops are amazing in orchards to really bring in some of those pollinators. And then in your landscaping too. It's not limited just to gardens and vegetables. If you have like an annual flower bed that you only put flowers in the spring, excuse me, you can always think about putting in like a winter cover crop in that area also. So there is a lot of different cover crops out there. So knowing how to select your species is typically the hardest or the most overwhelming part about cover crop selection. So really what you need to think about are some of these main 4 things. So what are your goals? What do you want out of your garden? Is it just you're just trying to grow some things out of because you like to get your hands dirty and work outside? Or are you looking for higher yield? Are you trying to produce enough food for your family for the entire winter? Or is your goal just to improve your soil health? Do you have a bad spot in your yard that you really want to make it better? Or is it being more sustainable and creating things on your own property? So do you want to make your own mulch with your cover crops, or cycle nutrients, or add that nitrogen back into the soil with those cover crops instead of adding a commercial fertilizer? The other thing to consider is your management level. Some people don't have the time, or maybe they need a lower management level type cover crop, so maybe oats. And then termination is a big thing with that management level also. How are you going to get rid of that cover crop, or does it winter kill itself? Then the third thing is experience. So I know Mike and I were just talking before this started, and I had said that I had planted some hairy vetch in my garden, and he had mentioned that that was a little higher on the experience level, and if I had worked with it before, and it is. And some of these do have different levels of experience, and some are harder to work with and some are very easy. So considering if you have planted cover crops or if you haven't, that can help you select your species. And then the last thing is your cash crop rotation. So maybe not a cash crop. I know we hear that word more in larger ag situations, but for your garden, your produce that you're going to be taking out of the garden, thinking about if you just have those warmer season crops like squashes and tomatoes and peppers, or you do cold season crops like your broccolis and lettuces. That'll help you to decide what type of cover crop you need, or what your crops are taking up nutrient wise. Are they heavy nitrogen feeders? Or do they need more potassium? That can kind of help you select your cover crop also. based on what kind of nutrients that cover crop is either going to provide or scavenge out of the soil. I guess really quick, do we have any questions while we're going through this, or do we want to wait till the end?
Well, if anyone has questions or comments, please either use the chat or just unmute and let us know, because that's the discussion is the best way to do this.
Agreed. All right, well, not hearing anything yet. I'll go ahead and keep going. So cover crop seeding windows. So this chart just looks like a whole bunch of colors and blocks. But depending on your cover crop, some of them can be seeded in the spring. Some of them don't do well in the spring because they need that hot weather. Some overwinter, some don't. So these seeding charts are available through the USDA and NRCS. And can be available in most of your soil and water districts have them, or you can look them up online too. But these show you when is a good time to plant, and then kind of when is the later time. And this one actually shows a little bit of guidance on after vegetables or after corn. So that kind of helps too on deciding what cover crop to select. So I always like this chart. Just always think of our scientific table and all those different elements. Well, there's a lot of different cover crops. Some of these are not necessarily suitable for a garden situation, but when it comes to like a large ag situation, a lot of times they can use a lot broader types, just because of the way they can terminate cover crops. But just a fun chart. Okay, so before we get started into some of the other species of cover crops, I wanted to talk about establishment. So cover crops can be established in a wide array of methods. When I used to work at the feed mill and we were mixing cover crop outside, we were mixing on a concrete pad and then the other side was on gravel. And cereal rye, I tell you, it will grow on anything. There was a lot of times it would sprout right off the concrete and in the gravel. So seeding some of these, a lot of them are pretty prolific and pretty hardy seeds, and they do pretty well. But as far as seeding methods, you can broadcast. So the picture in the bottom left is a broadcast seeder. You can use a seeder, or I myself, because I do so many different mixes, I just feed the chickens, just grab it and kind of sprinkle it out with my hand. Actually, the picture that is on the right there is cover crop that I just seeded like 2 days ago. It was oats, sorghum sudan, buckwheat, and hairy vetch. So that just went out a couple of days ago. And like I said, I just kind of raked away that straw and that residue that I had from my past cereal rye that I cut and used as mulch, and then just kind of broadcasted that seed right down on the ground. You can rake it in a little bit just to just kind of scratch the surface and get some really good seed to soil contact when you're broadcasting, but that's not always necessary. It does help when you're broadcasting to try and plant it with a rain event. So that rain will kind of help soak that seed right down into the ground. Some other ways you can are seeders. There's a little seeder on the top left that's probably used most of the time for like lettuce or greens, but it can be used for cover crop also if you want to keep things nice and clean in rows. Or if you have a larger area, that picture in the middle left is a no-till drill. And that can seed. Those come in a variety of sizes. That one's probably like an 8-foot wide, but they come up to like 30 or 40 feet wide. They get huge. So if you have a lot of acres, you can still cover those acres and get that cover crop seeded in. All right, so now we're going to get into actual cover crop species. So our first group of cover crops that I'm going to talk about is legumes. So legumes, some of these I'm talking about are summer or winter annuals. Legumes actually will take nitrogen from the air or from the atmosphere, and they will fix it in their roots. So that nitrogen will be available to the plants. that, or any of your like produce or corn and soybeans that you're planting in the ground. They also produce biomass and organic matter, and a lot of our legumes bloom. So they're really good to attract insects. So cowpeas is one that isn't super common, but it's around and I do really like to use them. They are a summer annual, and again, they do produce nitrogen. Cowpeas do have, when they leaf out, they have pretty heavy, oh goodness, like coverage of their leaves. So they're going to be really good at suppressing weeds and kind of blocking out the sun from hitting the ground, so you don't have as much weed germination, and it'll help kind of maintain that soil temperature. Cowpeas are a really good forage source. Most of the time they are used like as a cattle feed. So if you have chickens or something that you rotate around in your garden in between growing seasons, cowpeas are really good. And they do mix really well with sorghum Sudan, which I will talk about here just in a little bit. So the next one you heard me mention a little earlier is hairy vetch. This one is also a nitrogen source, so it's going to produce that nitrogen for you. And the other really cool thing about this one is it actually scavenges phosphorus. So any of that phosphorus that might be down in your soil, this plant is going, that wasn't used by your produce or your cash crop, it's going to take that up out of the soil and hold it until it is terminated the following spring. And then as that plant breaks down and that residue decomposes, it will release that phosphorus back to your cash crop or your produce that year. So instead of any of our nutrients that might leach out of the soil or that we might lose or might not be plant available, these cover crops are really going to help take that up and hold it. So we're not losing money on our commercial fertilizers or any of those nutrients that might leach out of the soil. Hairy vetch is one that is actually pretty shade and drought tolerant, so that makes it pretty versatile on where you can put it. This is one that I've used in annual flower gardens, and it blooms around mid-May, sometimes June, depending on the year. We never know what our weather is going to do in the spring, so May to June, depending on your location. And pollinators really do love those flowers. It's always buzzing and alive with the bees. The other cool thing, well, I say cool, some people might not like it, about hairy vetch is it is a vining plant. So it mixes really well with any of our cereal grains because it gives it that strong statured plant that can vine up. And it also makes a really good mulch. So after it has flowered, you can cut it at the base, and that will actually terminate the plant. And then I always leave mine where it is, so I'm growing my own mulch. When I cut it, normally I just take like a weed whacker to it, or you can use whatever method, use a flail mower or anything like that will work also. Or you can roll it or crimp it, as long as you're breaking that stem at the base after flowering. It'll terminate the plant, and then I typically plant my vegetables right into it. So with something like hairy vetch that has a lot of top growth, it's more suited towards planting transplants. So like your tomatoes or peppers or things you're going to buy as a plant, you can just kind of clear out a spot and dig a hole and plant it right into it. And since it is a legume, it does break down pretty fast. Most of our legumes do. So that mulch won't hinder the growth of any of your plants since it's going to decompose so readily. All right, crimson clover. So this is another one of my favorites. Crimson clover can be a little finicky depending on the area or the weather, but it is also a nitrogen producer and a scavenger. It's a very good soil builder because it does have such a dense top growth. The flowers are beautiful when they bloom. This is another one that I like to use in my annual flower beds. It has a great nectar source. for any of our beneficial insects and pollinators. So earlier I said it was kind of finicky with the weather. So depending on if you plant crimson clover with a mix, it does better. If it has another crop with it, like a cereal grain, or even ryegrass, which ryegrass I do not recommend in your garden, only as if you're experiencing cover crops in more of a large ag situation. But if you mix it with like oats or cereal rye, for a garden situation, it will do a little better because then it has some cover from those cold temperatures. If it gets a lot of frost in the winter without snow cover or without like a nurse crop with it, it might not survive the winter. But I have seen it planted early in the spring or frost seeded, and it does great just being planted in the spring. So field peas or winter peas are another of our vining legumes. So this is one that is very winter hardy. Again, it's a nitrogen producer. Winter peas are similar to vetch. They're very heavy biomass producers, so they have a lot of green top growth. It also grows very fast. The plants, as you can see here, they look similar to any of our other peas that we might grow in our garden. I guess since these are peas, that is one thing I will kind of elaborate on. When you're selecting cover crops for your garden, try not to plant the same like species of plant as a cover crop. So if you already are growing like snow peas or just peas in your garden for consumption, I would not plant like winter peas as a cover crop, but just because if there was any disease there or pests or insects that maybe were feeding on those peas, then you're just kind of going to compound the issue. So it needs to be a rotation. And it's the same thing when I get to brassicas here in a little bit. So any of your like turnips, radishes, or some of those different root cover crops, don't plant those in the same place as a cover crop wherever you're planting your, like I say, turnips and radishes in your garden. So make sure you're rotating that species to not get back to back. That'll just help with your pest and disease management. All right, so on to cereal grains. So there's they're all annual cereal grains. Our cereal grains mainly scavenge nutrients. They are known for reducing erosion because they have such a thick fibrous root ball. They do have very large amounts of biomass, which helps with the weed protection or weed suppression. And then I do have a warm season grass in here too, which it was the only one. So I kind of just included it in the cereal grains. So I didn't have to make the category just for itself. So the most common, well, not the most common, this one and oats, but cereal rye. So not to be confused with annual rye. So annual, it's typically annual rye grass, but a lot of people have a lot of different common names for these. So annual rye or cereal rye is the one you want for your garden. This one is really nice because it can be seeded later than any other cover crop. Cereal rye is very hardy and can germinate down to, I want to say it's like 34 to 36 degrees. So none of our other cover crops are going to germinate when it's that cold outside. So even if you're a little behind in your garden, this one can be planted easily into November, which makes it a nice option. It is very fast growing. It does have a really large fibrous root system, which can be a pro or a con, depending on your garden. So these are great in areas where you're either going to have transplants or to where you can like create a furrow. So it's a great mulch and can be cut down after the seed head has pollinated. So it looks very similar to wheat when the seed head comes out, and when it flowers, it will have little yellow pollen sacs that hang off of the seeds or the seed head on the top. And once that has happened, over at least 85% of the plants, you are safe to either go ahead and cut that at the base, or you can crimp it or just break the stems, and that will typically kill the plant. Sometimes you do have some regrowth, but normally crimping it or cutting it after it flowers and you see those little pollen sacs will terminate it. But with those large root balls, this can be hard to plant loose seeds or direct seeded crops. It can work, like I said, but you need to do like furrows to kind of push those root balls out of the way. But it's a great one. It's just kind of dependent on what cover crops are coming in. And our cereal grains are nitrogen scavengers, where our legumes are producers. Our cereal rice scavenge it. So any of that nitrogen that may have been left in the soil from the previous year's crop, it will soak that up and hold it in the leaves until it dies and decomposes. One thing I do want to mention about cereal rye is all of these plants have a carbon to nitrogen ratio, and our cereal grains are going to have a higher carbon ratio, which means that they're made up of more carbon, and for them to decompose and to break down, it's going to take a little longer. Whereas our legumes, like the crimson clover or the hairy vetch, those have a higher nitrogen ratio. So those are going to break down quicker. So where do you have your areas of cereal rye? If you're planting anything like sweet corn or tomatoes or some of our other higher nitrogen using vegetables, just make sure you really watch to make sure you don't have a nitrogen deficiency, because cereal rye, when it breaks down, it's still taking up that nitrogen. So just a little disclaimer, I haven't seen a ton of issues with this. Mainly you see those problems on like a large ag production where a farmer has done cereal rye and then they've planted their corn directly into it. But I really like cereal rye around most of my garden vegetables. And honestly, my favorite place is to do green beans in it. And yeah, when I cut it down, I make furrows and plant my green bean seeds right in between it in rows. And it works really, really well. So here's just a picture of my garden this year. So here's my cereal rye still standing. It was over my head, so it was probably every bit of, like, I'm not very tall, but it was over 5 feet tall. And then I had some extra cauliflower and broccoli that I planted right along the edge of it, and I had mulched. And then the picture on the right is after I cut it down. I was a little late this year on getting it cut down, so you can see there is some weed pressure in there. If I would have cut it right after it actually flowered and those pollen sacs were there, I might not have had the weed pressure that I did. But once it laid down, it did pretty good with adding a little bit more mulch to it. I'll have a couple more pictures of this later. This was supposed to be my pumpkin patch for the year, because pumpkins or any of our like squashes, they do really well on cereal rye mulch. It helps protect those large fruits, but I didn't get pumpkins in, and so it ended up being my location for my second crop of potatoes. All right, so oats. Oats are probably my favorite garden cover crop, just because they're very easy. So if you're a beginner, if you've never tried cover crops before, these are what I recommend. The reason oats are so easy is they germinate really quickly and easily, and they also winter kill. So in Indiana, we have frosts as early as October, sometimes earlier than that, but typically the frosts that kill oats are below 25 degrees. When you get some continuous days of cold, that will actually kill your oats. I have seen oats survive, very rarely. It kind of depends on if they're in a mix with other cover crops and they have some protection, or if there's like a heavy snowpack, sometimes they'll survive. But most of the time, oats always winter kill. They are a really good winter weed suppressor. So I just put some oats out where I did have my cabbage at. It was all done, so I put oats out in a mix with some other things. And the picture on the left is oats in August. This was from last year. I actually got them planted early. I planted my oats in July last year. So that was them in August, late August. And then the picture on the right is them after they have been terminated. And I got them planted early enough, they actually went to seed. But I did not have any germination issues from that seed. So that wasn't a problem. But that other picture is in February. So you can kind of see the difference. But you do have really good residue. It does break down really fast in the spring. I just went in with a weed eater and weed eated those oats down, and then it made a really nice mulch to plant some transplants right into. And these also scavenge nitrogen and really help build organic matter because they've got a good thick root system and leave some good biomass behind. So buckwheat is next. Buckwheat is a really fun one. It is probably our fastest establishing cover crop. It is a summer annual cover crop, so it loves the heat. So typically planting dates for buckwheat don't start until mid to the end of May, depending on how our temperatures are. It likes soil temperatures above 60 degrees. It will germinate and flower, I believe, within like 45 days. So it's a really fast cover crop. It's great for weed suppression because it grows so fast and that flesh is so thick. It's also a fantastic nectar source for any of our pollinators and beneficial insects. If you've ever walked past a field of buckwheat, it is just buzzing and is full of all those good insects. It also mixes well with sorghum sedan, which is another summer annual. I think that's my next one. One disclaimer with buckwheat. I know a lot of people really love it, and I know a lot of people hate it. So with buckwheat, because it is so fast establishing and its maturity date is so short, once it blooms, you only have a couple days before it actually starts to set seed. And those seeds are viable. So if you do let your buckwheat go to seed, you'll have buckwheat for quite a few years afterward, which if you like the buckwheat and you like the flowers, that's perfectly fine. I have a friend that has a pretty large organic farm and she has buckwheat mixed in everything just because she always lets it go to seed and it comes back. But her bees are happy. So it is all depending on your preference, if you want it to be there next year or if you don't. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So sorghum sedan, this is one that I hadn't played around a lot with, and I have the last couple years, and I really love it. It looks really similar to corn. It is a warm season grass. This one is going to produce the largest amounts of biomass. Sorghum sedan is typically actually a forage, but it works as a fantastic cover crop too. The cool thing with it is you can continue to like mow it and chop it down to about 6 inches and it keeps growing back. So you can get a lot of biomass if you're really trying to build your soil. With it being a summer annual, it also really, really likes the heat. This one is also very drought tolerant. I planted it last summer in my garden, and I planted it like early July, like around the 4th of July, after I harvested potatoes. And I only watered it once, and that was when I planted it. And then if I remember right, we had a pretty decent drought last summer and it still popped right up and ended up being like over 5 feet tall. I didn't ever cut mine back. I just let it grow. But it's a very big cover crop and is a good one for summer droughty hot seasons. And it is also a nitrogen scavenger. And it winter kills very quickly. It doesn't even necessarily take a frost, but a frost will definitely knock it out. It doesn't like cold temperatures at all. All right, so I didn't go into a lot of detail on brassicas. Typically, if you're a gardener, you know about turnips and radishes and some of the like canola and mustards, those kind of things. So these can all be used as cover crops. Typically, when we're talking about our brassicas, the reasons we're planting those is to reduce soil compaction. They all have large tuber type roots that go deep in the soil and help break up that compaction. They mix well with pretty much anything. They're also a really good forage source. So if you have chickens or cattle or sheep, these are awesome feed sources for those animals as well. So some of the not so common cover crops that you might see sometimes are sunflowers or phacelia. Phacelia is one that's not super common. I know the seed is crazy expensive this year, so you probably really won't see it as much. But it's like a low laying, like it kind of looks like a ground cover. It's got some purple flowers on it. It's also an annual. Perennial clovers. So I talked about orchards for just a second earlier. So any of our orchards or our perennial type crops, whether it's berries or you've got rhubarb, asparagus, some of those things that are a perennial crop, you can do perennial cover crops. So a lot of our like white clovers, outside clover, those are really good for those areas and will be a constant source of nitrogen and also a good source of nectar and pollen for any of our pollinator and insect species. And the last one that I see quite a bit of is sun hemp. It is very pretty with the yellow bloom on it. Again, that's one of those that the seed's pretty expensive. So you might not see it as often, but it does have a really nice taproot on it and people seem to like it in their gardens. So I talked about termination of some of these cover crops when I went through them. Like I said, some of them winter kill. Crimping is an option for hairy vetch, crimson clover, and the cereal rye. And then also the chop and drop mowing is the same thing as the ones that crimp. The biggest thing to note with these and kind of a disclaimer is make sure you get variety specified cover crop. So when you're buying cover crops, sometimes it'll say VNS, and that means variety not stated. And what that means is you can have all different varieties of cereal rye. They are all cereal rye, but some of those varieties may mature at different times. So if you're trying to do crimping or if you're trying to chop and drop that cereal rye, if it's all maturing at different times, you might struggle with some regrowth or getting your timing correct on terminating that crop. So you always want to have a variety. So whether that's Albion or I know there's a ton of different cover crop varieties out there for cereal rye, but just make sure it has that variety listed on your seed tag. And that'll really help with those maturity dates to make sure that everything is mature at the same time. Another way to kill cover crops is either solarization or I can't think of the other word for the black tarps. Ocular, yeah, can't remember. Anyway, you can kill them with tarps. So either black tarps, and basically the black tarps are just taking away all of that light and then adding that heat there, and it's going to eventually smother out and kill those cover crops. These do take longer to do. So depending on your cover crop and timing of the vegetable that you're planting or produce that you're planting, sometimes those can be difficult to do. And then the solarization, the clear tarps, that basically just cooks and burns your plant from the sun and that heat being so tight up against those plants. In both of these methods, you do want to water the soil underneath first, and that'll kind of help with that decomposition and that solarization happen a little faster. The other way that we can terminate our cover crops is with a herbicide. I know most of the time, a lot of us are not using herbicides in our garden. That's more of a large ag option, doing a burn down, but those are options also. If you are using a herbicide, just make sure you're following those labeled instructions on your herbicide and selecting the correct one. Some herbicides only kill broadleaf, so your legumes. Some are specific for grass. Some kill everything. So just really make sure you do your research and read the label and find out what's the safest and best option for your garden. And then just some last little benefits of cover crops. You can see that picture on the top left. That soil is extremely compacted. It just has platy structure. If you can imagine trying to be a root, trying to find its way through those plates, it can just be really difficult. So when we look at our soil, we want it to have a cottage cheese type texture or look like good moist chocolate cake is kind of what I always think about. So that picture there on the right, you can see those roots coming through there. You can see the pore spaces and just that nice aggregation in those soil structure that is still there. In Indiana, as most of you know, this soil has been disturbed a lot over the years. We were predominantly forest and everything was cleared for farm ground, and it's been conventionally tilled for a long time. Or if you live in a housing housing addition, some of those, the soil has been highly manipulated and compacted, or maybe even brought in from another site. So just trying to increase and build that organic matter back up that we may have lost over time with either tillage or transporting or compaction of that soil is a big thing that cover crops can do. And then also just maintaining that microbial life that is in our soil. I always say a lot of times that we're all livestock farmers, even though we don't know it. The amount of life that is in our soil is really incredible. There are so many microinvertebrates that are in there, worms and beetles and bacteria and all those other things that need the same four things that we do. They need shelter and air and food and water. So having these cover crops there gives them all four of those things. And then the last thing is hosting any of our beneficial or predator insects. Oh, where'd it go? I skipped ahead of myself. Okay. But anyway, hosting some of those beneficial and predator insects. So a lot of times in our gardens, we only think of bugs as pests. But a lot of times we can get those good predator insects like our parasitic wasps or ladybugs. They can actually take care of a lot of those pests. So not all bugs are bad. If you provide the right environment to attract those beneficial and predator insects, they can really be a good service to you. So just kind of a side to, or well, not side to side, top and bottom of my garden from this year. So just with gardening in general, whether it's with cover crops or without cover crops or experimenting with mulches and no-tills, it's a process. And it's an experiment every year. No matter if it worked last year, it might not work this year, especially with our variable weather. So I just wanted to share this picture. Stuff changes and goes really fast throughout the growing season. The top picture is from probably, I want to say, the end of April. So you can kind of see the cover crop, the cereal rye in the background, and then there's a couple plants in there. I think the potatoes and squash was the only thing really going. And then the bottom picture was just from about, I think, 2 weeks ago, and everything is growing and big, although I've got some sad diseased tomatoes. Like I said, no matter what we do, it's always an experiment, and there's trials and tribulations of gardening. So just keep doing what you're doing, keep experimenting, keep trying. It's different for everybody, and depending on the weather, we never know what's going to work or not work. And just kind of another thing that I try and think about with my garden and with cover crops, really, we're trying to mimic Mother Nature with these soil health principles and with cover crops. Like I said earlier, there's not very many places in nature where you find bare soil, or where there's not living roots all year long, or where the soil is continuously disturbed. So if we can just kind of look around us, keep an eye on how Mother Nature is doing things, I think that can really give us a good idea on how to garden and how to sustain any of that habitat underground and really produce the best, healthiest plants that we can in our garden. And just, I talked about beneficial insects. So if you provide the right habitat, they will come. Picture on the left is a tomato hornworm that has been as a host for a parasitic wasp. All of those little white eggs that you can see are that wasp's eggs. So they will feed off of that caterpillar and then become wasps of themselves. So they're taking care of those bad insects that we don't want in our garden. And then also, this is some clover that I have around my berry planting at home. So bringing in butterflies to help pollinate any of those perennial crops that you might have. And that is all I have. So if you guys have any questions, please let me know. My email is there, and I'd be glad to help.
Bree, we have one comment on the chat room. I have heard of winter cover crops, but not summer covers. How do you plan summer cover crops?
All right, so summer cover crops. So I really like to use summer cover crops after. So if I have an area where I've done like lettuces, or like, for instance, my potatoes, that's where I always do summer cover crops. Typically potatoes go in March, and so they can be harvested in July. So kind of similar to like what wheat would. So a lot of our larger farms do cover crops after wheat. So I always do summer cover crops after my potatoes. And then sometimes after like lettuces, which most of the time after my lettuce, I'm doing intensive cropping. So I'm having another vegetable go in, not necessarily a cover crop. And depending on the size of your garden, if you have an area where you can leave fallow that year, you can do an entire year of cover crops, which I like to do in my own garden. I live down in southern Indiana, so we have really heavy, like wet clay soils. So I try and always have one section of my garden that gets a full year of rest and a full year of cover crops. So that's kind of where those summer annuals fit in. Most of those can be planted in mid-May, and then they're going to die off with that first frost. So like the cowpeas are summer. The sorghum sedan is a summer crop. Those sunflowers would be, and then the buckwheat. So those are probably the four that I listed in today. I know there's a bunch of other cover crops out there, but that's kind of how I plan. Is it's just dependent on whatever produce I take out. If it's done in July or August, you have a big enough window to do that summer cover crop.
Yeah. Have you ever done companion cropping like the colonial days? The Indians suggested the three mixes: this corn, squash, and beans together growing at the same time.
I have not. That's one thing where I've read a bunch of permaculture books and I'm like trying to get that in my head, but for some reason I still have everything clumped together. It's not in rows necessarily. But I do try and do flowers with a lot of my vegetables, or if it's like some type of herb. So I know like I've got dill and marigolds and oregano, and I try and pair stuff together. So like I had potatoes and cabbage in the same bed, and I have tomatoes and basil in the same bed. So just I do companion crop some, but I guess not super intensely.
Mm-hmm. So anybody else, any questions? What questions do you have? Any comments for Bree? This has been really great. You have hit every one of the highlights for me.
Good. I'm so glad.
Any other comments from? Okay, here's one. I've read that cover crops can be used as green manure where the cover crop is tilled in. Is this a good way to build soil? And if you plant a legume, will the soil receive the same amount of nitrogen?
Yeah, so cover crops are definitely a fantastic green manure. You can till them in, or you can let them sit on the surface as a mulch and decompose. Either way, you're going to get that same benefit from that nitrogen cycling. As far as planting a legume and getting your nitrogen, so it's very weather dependent, and it's very dependent on the maturity of your plant. So to find out for sure how much nitrogen you're getting, I know quite a few people do pretty intensive like tissue sampling to see how much nitrogen they're getting out of their plants. I don't know exact sciences on that, but I know the nitrogen that you get back is weather dependent and maturity dependent on the plant. So like some of your legumes, like the vetch and the clover, if you don't let them go all the way to bloom, you might not get the same amount of nitrogen if you terminate them when they're only a couple inches tall, say like in April or something. But yes, good green manure, it'll definitely help cycle those nutrients.
Yeah, some of the legumes, to get the nitrogen fixing properties, need inoculation, or they need the bacteria in the soil. So once you've raised them, you probably have that bacteria in there. But if you're new to it, or if you're using a heavy peat or mulch that doesn't have a legume in it, you might have to nudge or to put bacteria with it to do it. So which cover crops need seeded and which can be broadcast?
So, I mean, if you're broadcasting in a small scale, you can pretty much broadcast anything except for, I will say, like some of our brassicas that are a little larger seeded, like some of the radishes, and then like the cow peas or the winter peas, our larger seeded cover crops do need that soil to seed to soil contact. So those would benefit if you like rake them in, or if you plant those and then put like a shallow layer of compost on top. That would definitely help those, just because they are that larger seed, so they do struggle to germinate on top of the soil. But any of your like very small seeded stuff, like the crimson clover, or oh goodness, canola, any of those other like small seeded, they definitely will soak right into the ground just fine without being interseeded.
You made a comment on frost seeding. Can you elaborate a little better on what's
Yeah.
the timing and how that works?
So frost seeding is anytime that the ground is frozen, or either like before or after a snowfall. So frost seeding is good for any of those seeds that have a hard seed coat. So most of the time, like when we're talking cover crops, that's going to be our clovers, or the radishes also have a hard seed coat. So when you frost seed those, you get that freeze thaw action in the ground. It'll actually suck those seeds down into the ground, and then that freeze thaw will help break that hard coating open on the seed, and allow it to germinate better. So frost seeding, typically in Indiana, the best time to frost seed is anywhere between like February and March. You don't want to do it too late in, or too early in the winter, sorry, like December timeframe, just because if we do get some of those warm days and that seed happens to germinate, it'll get killed at the last or at the next frost. But typically if you do like late February to early March, we're going to be kind of creeping into those warmer days. So that's typically a good timing. But checking the seeding calculator that I showed in the presentation, or seeding date calendar, you can find those online or at your local SWCD. Those are really good to find your seeding dates for frost seeding too, depending on the cover crop.
We have another question. Which cover crops scavenge potassium and phosphorus? And if I can add a comment to that, the buckwheat fixing phosphorus or making phosphorus available. So any comments on that, scavenging and fixing, producing?
Yeah, buckwheat was definitely going to be the one I talked about with phosphorus for sure. I don't know about potassium, to be honest. And I think that's one of the hardest thing with cover crops is, I mean, they're definitely a hot topic right now, but as far as like scientific studies behind them, on exact nutrient scavenging and that kind of thing, I don't know. At least I haven't seen it. That doesn't mean it's not out there. I don't know exactly how much comes up, and it's all so dependent on soil and weather and maturity that it's hard to say
Oh.
exactly
Bree, you kind of are cutting out to me. Is it my side or is it yours?
She cut out for me too, Mike.
Okay, well, we can go
Right
back
there.
to her. If anybody has questions, oh, sorry. If anybody has questions for us and we can keep going, we'll try to get Bree back. If not, thanks to you for joining. Joelle, do you want to share about the Urban and Small Farms program we have running at the Allen County SWCD?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Joelle Neff. I'm in charge of our Urban and Small Farms program here at the Allen County Soil and Water Conservation District. So we do a variety of things here, and thanks again so much to Bree. What a wealth of information. I always love having speakers on here because I learn so much that I can implement into my garden, which I love. One of the things that we can do here at the district is we have cover crop seed. We have a couple of different mixes. If anyone is interested in trying some this fall, we do have a cereal rye and radish mix, and I think there's crimson clover in there as well. And then we have an oats and radish mix, which is a really great starter package, which you can try on your operation. We also do free soil testing for those in our project area. So we cover parts of Allen County, Adams County, DeKalb, Steuben, Noble, and Wells. So parts of those. And then there's another local program, which if you can't be in ours, they can also pay for your soil testing for your gardens. And then we can also come do site visits for you to talk about cover crops and soil health. And if you have any questions, we can connect you with master gardeners who also are a wealth of knowledge on different pests and maybe some weed species that you're not familiar with. We're able to connect you. If you have any more questions, please feel free to email Mike or I, or to email Bree. She had her email on there with any more questions. I know I have a few more that I'm going to be sending her way. So that's all I have. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Mike, or to Bree if you have anything else to say.
All right, let me add one more thing. So our next coffee is Coffee and Business Management on September 21st of 2022 with Dave Vors. He's a local farmer and in the banking industry, so a wealth of knowledge. So if you're interested in managing your businesses, that is a great resource. So any other questions for Bree? I'm willing to, I think we might have her back again. She said it just froze and cut out. Is Bree with us again? Oh, well, maybe not. So thank you, Bree, for sharing that. Again, this will be available at the Allen County Soil and Water Conservation District website when it gets uploaded, it gets finished, and you can view it again anytime. Am I forgetting anything else, Joelle? You good?
No, I think you're good.
Okay. Again, thank you, Bree, if you're listening, and thanks everybody for joining us. It was a good time to see you. Thank you and goodbye.